The autopsy of Napoleon Bonaparte revealed something far more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. What the physicians discovered inside the emperor's body would spark 2 centuries of debate, conspiracy theories, and scientific investigation that continues to this day. The year was 1821, and the remote island of St. Helena had become the final prison for the man who once ruled most of Europe. But on that humid May evening, as tropical storms battered the isolated British outpost, a different kind of tempest was brewing inside Longwood House. The death rattle of an empire echoed through the damp walls, and what transpired in those final hours was not merely the end of a life, but the beginning of a mystery that would haunt historians for generations. Before you hear what they found, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss more dark revelations from history's most shocking moments. The popular imagination has sanitized Napoleon's death into something almost dignified, a fallen emperor passing peacefully into exile's embrace. But the reality was far more sinister and infinitely more disturbing. The autopsy performed on May 6, 1821, revealed anatomical anomalies so unusual that the British authorities attempted to suppress certain details. Today, we strip away 2 centuries of myth and examine the unflinching reality of what killed the most powerful man in 19th century Europe, and why his own closest allies might have wanted him dead. To understand the horror found within Napoleon's corpse, we must first grasp the man he had been at his zenith. In 1807, Napoleon stood as master of Europe, his Grande Armée having crushed the combined forces of Austria, Prussia, and Russia in brilliant campaigns that rewrote the rules of warfare. He was then a lean, energetic figure, famous for his ability to work 20 hours straight, surviving on minimal sleep and maintaining a physique hardened by years of campaigning. Contemporary accounts describe him as possessing an almost supernatural energy, his grey eyes burning with ambition that seemed to physically radiate from his compact frame. This was the man who had crowned himself emperor in Notre Dame, who had redrawn the map of Europe according to his will, whose very name could make monarchs tremble. But power, as it always does, carried within it the seeds of its own destruction. The transformation from Europe's conqueror to St. Helena's prisoner was not merely political, but profoundly physical. When Napoleon arrived on the volcanic island in October 1815, British officers were shocked by how much he had already changed from the dynamic general of legend. His face had grown puffy and sallow, his famous tricorn hat now sat awkwardly atop thinning hair, and his once athletic frame had begun its grotesque expansion. The isolation of St. Helena, with its perpetual dampness and restricted diet, would accelerate this deterioration in ways that puzzled even his physicians. The island itself seemed designed to break both body and spirit. St. Helena, a mere 47 square miles of volcanic rock in the South Atlantic, was chosen precisely for its remoteness. The nearest land was over 1,000 miles away, making escape impossible. Longwood House, Napoleon's residence, was infested with rats, perpetually damp from the tropical humidity, and battered by trade winds that made the walls shake. The emperor, who had once commanded palaces across Europe, now lived in conditions that would have appalled a common soldier. His British captors, led by the petty and vindictive Governor Hudson Lowe, seemed to delight in these humiliations, restricting his movements, censoring his correspondence, and treating him not as a former head of state, but as a dangerous criminal. What made Napoleon's deterioration particularly disturbing was its rapid acceleration after 1818. His personal physician, Francesco Antommarchi, documented symptoms that seemed to defy medical explanation. The emperor's legs swelled to enormous proportions. His skin took on a peculiar yellowish tint, and he began experiencing violent stomach pains that left him writhing in agony for hours. His famous energy evaporated, replaced by a lethargy so profound that he would sometimes remain in his bath for entire days, the water grown cold around his bloated form. Most bizarrely, his body began to feminize, his chest developing breast tissue, his body hair falling out, his skin becoming soft and hairless like a woman's. These symptoms, Antomarchi noted with clinical precision, suggested something far more complex than simple illness. The final year of Napoleon's life was marked by increasingly bizarre symptoms that his physicians struggled to explain. His appetite would swing between complete revulsion at food and desperate animalistic hunger. He would demand specific dishes from his glory days, elaborate French preparations impossible to create with St. Helena's limited resources, then violently vomit after a few bites. His sleep became tormented by nightmares where he relived his greatest battles, shouting orders to long-dead marshals, weeping for soldiers fallen at Waterloo. Servants reported finding him collapsed on the floor, muttering about poison, about enemies within his own household, about British assassins creeping through the tropical nights. By early 1821, Napoleon's condition had deteriorated beyond recognition. Count de Montauban, one of his few remaining companions, wrote secret letters describing scenes of Gothic horror. The emperor would experience seizures that left him temporarily blind, his eyes rolling back to show only whites. His vomit turned black as coffee grounds, a sign his physicians recognized as internal bleeding. Yet between these episodes, he would have moments of terrifying lucidity, where he would grab his attendants and whisper about feeling something eating him from within, some presence in his stomach that was slowly devouring him. "They are killing me by inches," he reportedly said, though whether he meant his British captors or something more sinister remained unclear. The peculiar nature of Napoleon's symptoms sparked suspicion even before his death. His hair began falling out in clumps, a symptom inconsistent with stomach cancer, the official diagnosis his physicians were approaching. His fingernails developed strange white lines called Mies's lines, a clinical sign that would not be properly understood for decades. His extreme thirst, drinking gallons of water and lemonade daily, coupled with his sweet-smelling breath, suggested metabolic disruption. Most tellingly, his mental faculties would swing between perfect clarity and delusional paranoia. He became convinced that Count de Montauban's wife was poisoning him, then hours later would beg her forgiveness and shower her with affection. In his final months, Napoleon's paranoia intensified to an almost unbearable degree. He insisted that his food be tasted by others first, changed his dietary routine constantly to avoid establishing patterns, and would sometimes refuse all sustenance for days, surviving only on water and weak wine. He ordered his servants to nail shut certain windows, convinced that assassins were entering his room at night to administer poison through the air itself. The British dismissed these fears as delirium, but Napoleon's companions noticed that his symptoms seemed to worsen after certain meals, particularly those prepared when specific members of the household were on kitchen duty. The death watch began in earnest on April 15, 1821, when Napoleon collapsed with violent stomach convulsions that left him unable to stand. For the next 3 weeks, he lingered in a twilight between life and death, his body consuming itself as his weight plummeted. The swollen, feminized figure deflated like a punctured balloon, leaving skin hanging loose on a skeleton that seemed to shrink daily. His famous grey eyes, once sharp enough to terrify generals, now stared unfocused at shadows only he could see. The smell of decay began emanating from his body even while he lived, a sweet, sickly odor that forced attendants to burn incense constantly. On May 5th, as a violent storm lashed St. Helena, Napoleon entered his final agony. Witnesses described convulsions so severe that 4 men had to hold him down. He screamed about eagles and armies, about Josephine and his son, about poisons and betrayals. Then suddenly he became calm, almost serene. His last coherent words, according to Napoleon, were, "France, army, head of the army, Josephine." But what came after, in the delirium of his final hours, was far more disturbing. Antomarchi recorded that Napoleon seemed to be arguing with invisible presences, pleading his case before some unseen tribunal, confessing to crimes no one in the room understood. At 5:49 in the evening, as the tropical sun set behind storm clouds, Napoleon Bonaparte drew his last breath. But death did not end the horror, it merely transformed it. Within hours, his body began to change in ways that defied natural decomposition. His face, gaunt from weeks of suffering, seemed to fill out again. His skin, which had been yellow and mottled, became white as marble. Most disturbingly, his body appeared to resist decomposition in the tropical heat, remaining fresh far longer than it should have. These anomalies would fuel speculation that whatever had killed Napoleon had also preserved him, like some grotesque chemical embalming that had begun while he still lived. The autopsy, performed the next day, was conducted under extraordinary circumstances that immediately raised suspicions. British authorities insisted on their own physicians being present, while Napoleon's French attendants demanded representation. The result was a crowded room with 17 observers, creating an atmosphere more like a theatrical performance than a medical procedure. Dr. Antomarchi, who led the examination, would later claim that British officials prevented him from conducting certain tests and confiscated tissue samples he attempted to preserve. The body was opened on a table in the billiard room, tropical heat and humidity making the procedure even more gruesome as blood and bodily fluids leaked onto the felt surface. What Antomarchi found inside Napoleon's body defied conventional medical explanation. The stomach, which he expected to find ravaged by cancer, showed a single perforation surrounded by what he described as a ring of extremely hard schist-like tissue, unlike any cancer I have encountered. The liver was enlarged to nearly twice its normal size, yet showed no signs of the cirrhosis one would expect from Napoleon's occasional heavy drinking. Most bizarrely, the heart and lungs were covered in an unusual amount of fatty tissue, despite Napoleon's dramatic weight loss in his final weeks. The internal organs seemed to have been preserved by some process, appearing fresher than they should given the tropical conditions and the time elapsed since death. The stomach's contents provided the most disturbing discovery. Antomarchi found it filled with a dark, coffee ground-like substance mixed with what appeared to be partially dissolved tissue. But within this mass, he discovered something that made him pause in his documentation. According to his private notes, only revealed decades later, there were crystalline deposits unlike anything that should naturally occur in human stomach contents. These crystals, which he carefully preserved despite British attempts to confiscate them, would later be subjected to chemical analysis with shocking results. The British physicians, however, insisted the autopsy report mention only cancer, forbidding any reference to these anomalous findings. Dr. Thomas Short, one of the British physicians present, later wrote in his private journal about peculiarities in the corpse that suggested the prolonged administration of metallic substances. He noted that Napoleon's organs showed signs of chronic inflammation consistent with repeated exposure to irritants, not the acute damage of disease. The bladder was contracted to less than a third of its normal size. The kidneys showed unusual scarring, and the intestines displayed patches of blackened tissue that looked burned rather than diseased. These observations were deliberately excluded from the official autopsy report, which simply stated that Napoleon died of stomach cancer, the same disease that allegedly killed his father. The physical preservation of Napoleon's body continued to baffle observers. When the coffin was opened 20 years later for the return of his remains to France, witnesses were shocked to find the body virtually intact. In the tropical climate of St. Helena, where bodies typically decomposed rapidly, Napoleon appeared as if he had been buried weeks, not decades before. His skin retained its marble-like pallor, his features were perfectly recognizable, and even his clothing remained largely preserved. This unnatural preservation suggested that whatever had coursed through Napoleon's body in life had fundamentally altered its chemistry, creating a form of chemical mummification. Modern analysis of Napoleon's hair, conducted using neutron activation analysis, has revealed concentrations of arsenic up to 40 times higher than normal levels. But more disturbing than the presence of arsenic itself was its distribution pattern. The analysis showed that Napoleon had been exposed to arsenic in irregular doses over his final years, with peaks corresponding to his worst episodes of illness. This pattern suggested not accidental environmental exposure, but deliberate administration, carefully calibrated to cause maximum suffering while avoiding immediate death. The arsenic levels were highest in the hair from his final months, reaching concentrations that should have killed him much sooner than they did. But arsenic alone doesn't explain all the anomalies found in Napoleon's body. Modern toxicologists examining the historical records have identified symptoms consistent with mercury poisoning, particularly the mental disturbances and the unusual preservation of the corpse. Mercury was commonly used in 19th century medicine, often in a preparation called calomel, prescribed for digestive issues. Napoleon's physicians attempting to treat his stomach problems may have inadvertently poisoned him with mercury, while someone else was simultaneously administering arsenic. This deadly cocktail would explain the bizarre constellation of symptoms that no single poison could produce. The question that haunted investigators was not just what killed Napoleon, but who administered the poison and why. Count de Montauban, who controlled much of Napoleon's household and stood to inherit a fortune from the emperor's will, had both means and motive. His wife, Albine, had been Napoleon's mistress, creating a complex dynamic of jealousy and opportunity. Montauban's financial records, examined years later, showed mysterious payments from sources that historians have linked to Bourbon royalists who wanted to ensure Napoleon never returned to France. But was Montauban acting alone? Or was he part of a larger conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of British government? The British had their own compelling reasons to want Napoleon dead. As long as he lived, he remained a rallying point for French nationalism and a potential threat to European stability. Governor Hudson Lowe's correspondence, declassified only in the 20th century, reveals deep anxiety about Napoleon's continued existence. "The general's presence continues to agitate Europe," he wrote. "Every day he lives is a day the Bourbon throne trembles." There were discussions at the highest levels about the St. Helena problem, with subtle hints that a natural death would solve many diplomatic difficulties. Did these discussions translate into action, perhaps through British agents working with French collaborators? Even more disturbing is the possibility that Napoleon was poisoned not by his enemies, but by his own physicians. Dr. Antomarchi's medical notes show he prescribed tartar emetic containing antimony in Napoleon's final days. Combined with the calomel other physicians were administering, this created a potentially lethal combination. The antimony would have caused violent purging, depleting Napoleon's potassium levels, while the mercury damaged his organs. When Napoleon was given a massive dose of calomel just days before his death, ostensibly to treat constipation, it may have been the final blow to his poison system. Were the doctors incompetent, or were they deliberately creating a toxic synergy that would appear to be natural disease? The feminization of Napoleon's body adds another layer of mystery. While this could be explained by the hormonal effects of chronic arsenic poisoning, some historians have suggested a more sinister interpretation. There are accounts of Napoleon being given special tonics prepared by Napoleon, supposedly to boost his strength. These tonics, if they contained plant estrogens or other hormonal substances, could have been designed to humiliate and weaken the emperor, both physically and psychologically. The deliberate feminization of the hypermasculine conqueror would have been the ultimate revenge for those who had suffered under his wars. Napoleon's own suspicions about being poisoned were dismissed as paranoia, but his political instincts had always been sharp. In his will, dictated just weeks before his death, he wrote, "I die prematurely, murdered by the English oligarchy and its hired assassin." At Brie, he specifically requested that his body be examined for signs of poison, a request that was ignored by British authorities. His insistence on detailed documentation of his symptoms, which he made his physicians swear to preserve, suggests he knew something was wrong beyond simple illness. Did Napoleon discover the plot against him but find himself powerless to stop it, trapped on an island where every person could be a potential assassin? The preservation of tissue samples from Napoleon's autopsy has allowed modern science to probe deeper into the mystery. Recent spectroscopic analysis of these samples has revealed not just arsenic and mercury, but traces of other heavy metals, including lead and antimony, in concentrations that suggest chronic exposure. The combination of these toxins would have created a synergistic effect, each amplifying the damage of the others. This toxic cocktail would explain symptoms that puzzled contemporary physicians. The extreme mood swings, the hormonal changes, the preservation of the corpse, and the agonizing death that seemed to come from multiple organ failure rather than a single disease. What makes the evidence particularly compelling is what was found in Napoleon's wine. Analysis of residue from bottles preserved from Longwood House showed arsenic concentrations that could only result from deliberate addition. The wine was Napoleon's preferred drink, and he often drank it alone in his study, making it an ideal vehicle for poison. The irregular nature of the poisoning, with periods of recovery followed by sudden relapses, corresponds exactly to Napoleon's wine consumption patterns documented by his valets. Someone with intimate knowledge of his habits was carefully controlling the dosing, maintaining a level of illness that appeared natural while slowly destroying his body from within. The British government's behavior after Napoleon's death raises additional questions. Official records from 1821 were sealed for 100 years, and when finally released, key documents were missing. The autopsy report was edited multiple times, with each version showing significant changes. British physicians who attended Napoleon were given generous pensions and sworn to secrecy about their observations. Governor Lowe was immediately recalled to London and given a prestigious posting, despite his apparent failure to keep Napoleon alive. These actions suggest a cover-up at the highest levels, aimed at concealing the true nature of Napoleon's death. Perhaps most disturbing is the fate of those who knew the truth. Dr. Barry O'Meara, Napoleon's first physician on St. Helena, was dismissed and discredited after suggesting Napoleon was being slowly poisoned. Francesco Antomacci fled to Cuba after Napoleon's death, refusing to discuss certain aspects of the autopsy despite numerous offers from publishers. Count Bertrand, Napoleon's most loyal companion, destroyed portions of his diary dealing with the emperor's final months, telling his family that some truths were too dangerous to preserve. Even Montholon, the suspected poisoner, lived in constant fear after Napoleon's death, changing residences frequently and dying under mysterious circumstances that suggested he too had been silenced. The implications of Napoleon's poisoning extend beyond the fate of one man. If the evidence is correct, it represents one of history's most elaborate murders, a conspiracy involving multiple nations, numerous individuals, and a careful plan executed over years. The poison was administered slowly enough to appear natural, with symptoms mimicking known diseases while being documented by physicians who were either complicit or deceived. The cover-up that followed involved the falsification of medical records, the intimidation of witnesses, and the destruction of evidence on a scale that required governmental resources. Modern forensic science has provided compelling evidence that Napoleon was murdered, but the full truth remains elusive. The arsenic in his hair could have come from multiple sources, as it was present in many 19th century products from wallpaper to rat poison. The mercury could have been medicinal rather than malicious. The preservation of his body might have been a natural anomaly rather than chemical mummification. But taken together, the evidence points toward a deliberate assassination disguised as natural death, executed with a sophistication that would be impressive even by today's standards. The autopsy findings that were suppressed in 1821 have now been vindicated by modern science. The crystalline deposits Antommarchi found were likely arsenic compounds. The organ preservation was consistent with heavy metal poisoning. The feminization, the hair loss, the mental symptoms all point toward chronic poisoning with multiple substances. What the original autopsy revealed was evidence of murder, evidence that powerful forces worked to suppress for 2 centuries. The physicians who performed that examination knew they were looking at something unnatural, something that challenged the official narrative of cancer, but they were silenced by political necessity. In examining what was found inside Napoleon's body, we confront uncomfortable truths about power, assassination, and historical manipulation. The emperor, who had changed the face of Europe, was reduced to a victim of slow poisoning, dying in agony while his killers watched and documented his decline. The evidence hidden in his corpse, those chemical signatures of murder, remained dormant for generations, waiting for science to advance enough to reveal them. Napoleon's body became a crime scene preserved in time, holding secrets that would take 2 centuries to decode. The horror of Napoleon's death lies not just in the physical suffering he endured, but in the calculated nature of his destruction. This was not a crime of passion or a battlefield death, but a methodical elimination performed under the guise of natural illness. The poison coursing through his veins transformed the conqueror into a victim, the powerful into the powerless, the feared into the pitied. His body, invaded by toxins that slowly destroyed him from within, became a testament to the lengths his enemies would go to ensure he never returned to power. Today, as we examine the evidence found within Napoleon's corpse, we must ask ourselves a disturbing question. If one of history's most powerful men could be murdered so elaborately, with the crime hidden for 2 centuries despite numerous witnesses and medical examinations, what other historical deaths have been similarly disguised? The crystalline deposits in Napoleon's stomach, the preserved organs that defied tropical decay, the feminine transformation of his body, all speak to a crime of unprecedented sophistication. Was Napoleon Bonaparte, the man who made Europe tremble, slowly poisoned to death on St. Helena? The evidence found inside his body suggests exactly that. But perhaps the most chilling aspect is not that he was murdered, but that his killers so nearly succeeded in hiding their crime forever. Only the strange preservation of his body, that unintended consequence of the poisons used, allowed modern science to uncover what 19th century politics had concealed. The emperor's corpse, in its unnatural preservation, became an accusation from beyond the grave, evidence of a murder that changed the course of history. The final mystery remains: who ordered Napoleon's death? Was it the British government fearing his potential return, the Bourbon royalists ensuring their restoration would be permanent? Or was it someone closer, someone within his own household who had grown tired of exile and saw poison as the path to freedom? The answer may lie in those missing British documents, in Montholon's destroyed papers, or in secrets that died with the witnesses. What we know for certain is what the autopsy revealed: evidence of murder written in arsenic and mercury, preserved in organs that refused to decay, a crime scene frozen in time within the body of an emperor. If you found this dark chapter of history as disturbing as we did, subscribe now to uncover more shocking truths that have been hidden for centuries. What other historical figures met ends far different from what we've been told.